Hi, all. Hope you're doing well. I'm giving you the last update of the week here. I'm going to look at the civil rights movement a little bit more. I've posted some things. Hopefully, you've been able to keep up. Um, Most of you have responded, which is great. A little bit rainy out there today, but hopefully, the weekend will be a little bit better. And that you have a long weekend. Enjoy it and relax and stay positive. There's some good news, obviously, coming out in terms of this virus, and hopefully that we're seeing some progress, substantial progress being made. So who knows what the future holds, and and who knows when we'll see each other again? But you know it'll be good. So anyways, what I want to do is, your paper is due on April 17th. Some of you have already been asking me some good questions, which is great. And these lessons are designed to support you in that process. I just posted a excellent video called "The Freedom Riders." Um, it's funny because it says BBC on it, so I think that's how the authors kind of got away with it, But it's a really good documentary about the Freedom Rides and what happened in the South during the era of segregation and civil rights, and it's really, really good. It's long. It says 3 hours, but it's really not. It's an hour. I believe might be 2 hours, and it starts over again. So don't be, it's not 3 hours. But if you start watching, it's one of those things that hooks you right in because it's really good. It's a really good video, and it kind of you almost feel like you're there in some parts of that. Um, all right, I want to start with civil rights and John F. Kennedy. So now, as we're teaching thematically, remember that Kennedy is elected president in 1960. Okay, so basically you've got World War II end. You have Truman as president, and you have Eisenhower, who's basically president for almost all of the 1950s. Kennedy comes in 1960 with a lot of optimism. Our economy is absolutely booming. We're in a Cold War and we'll talk more about that in our next unit, but we're in a Cold War with Russia, which was a period of tension between us and them, both nuclear capable, which was scary. And I kind of grew up at the tail end of that era, so I remember what that was like. But the Kennedy comes in 1960 with a lot of optimism. He was kind of known as the can-do president. He got some really bright individuals. David Halberstam from Winston wrote a book about them called "The Best and the Brightest," because they were the kind of these Ivy League educated younger guys in terms of what you traditionally see in government, and they were ready to kind of take on the world and make the United States even greater and keep us safe and all of these things. But one of the things that Kennedy is confronted with is this civil rights agitation that's occurring throughout the country. Kennedy's from Massachusetts, so he's a white northerner. Um, and he kind of takes over and right away is confronted with, what are you going to do about this? So Kennedy appoints several African Americans to high positions, high appointees, but he also gets some criticism because we see that he also simultaneously appoints segregationists to key judicial positions. So it seems like Kennedy is trying to take something of a moderate position to keep our country together. But so as much as he kind of forwards some things, he gets criticized as well because he does seem to be trying to appease the segregationist groups in our country. The other thing you may remember, which is a little complicated, but there was a large number of Southern Democrats. So Kennedy's a Democrat, and Southern Democrats were still known as, as being from the South. It wasn't as regionalized as it is today, but the Southern Democrat was still a reality. So within Kennedy's party, you had at the time you had many Democrats that were sympathetic, were actually encouraged and advocated for segregation. The other thing that happens at this time, early 1960s, is there starts to be a wave of activism that takes place in the South. This is primarily fueled by the Congress of Racial Equality, as well as Martin Luther King Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Okay, so Martin Luther King Jr., people are starting to hear about him. He's taking a role of prominence. And what you see is it's largely a student movement at first, where they're doing sit-ins. Now, what sit-ins were, they would go into counters and places where they were not supposed to be, because it was strictly segregated between whites and blacks. So eventually, as we talked about last time, you have the Civil Rights Act that passed in 1964, which is supposed to desegregate these areas. So remember, you have something called de jure segregation and de facto segregation. De jure is legal segregation, where de facto is actual segregation. So you could have segregation outlawed, but in fact still have it practiced. Okay, that's a way to think about it. So these students, even prior to '64, go in and they protest and have sit-ins. And maybe you've seen videos, and if you click on the video, the documentary of the Freedom Rides, you'll see this, where African Americans are yanked off their seats, they're punched, they have milkshakes poured over their head. The most famous is in Greensboro, North Carolina, where this happens, at a Woolworths counter. We used to have a Woolworths in Torrington, downtown, over by where Olympia Sports is now. There was a counter, and it was a department store where you could get lunch. I still remember as a kid looking at the big juice bins, wishing I could have a big glass of fruit punch. My mother kind of dragged me through the store. But it was right downtown. There was a Woolworths, and it was a cultural icon, kind of like Howard Johnson's used to be, which you probably aren't aware of that either. But both of those were big things. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is formed in April of '61, and they're a big part of this. Okay, so now remember that television is in a lot of homes. So Americans now see the African Americans being beaten, being discriminated against, and they are nonviolent, so they are not responding in any way. So they organize these freedom rides where they want to desegregate buses. Okay, so there's a lot of things that begin to happen, and the places like Selma, Alabama, and Montgomery, Alabama, and Mississippi. These are key areas where segregation is still occurring, and these are targets now of the civil rights activists. Okay, to desegregate these areas and bring attention, national attention, to these areas. And so the Supreme Court, the Interstate Commerce Commission, says it's going to back up the segregation legislation, and that's been passed. And then they basically turn a lot of their attention in the early '60s to Birmingham, Alabama, where thousands of them are arrested. Okay, and that's where Martin Luther King Jr. writes "Letter from a Birmingham Jail," which is one of the most famous letters in American history. Okay, the Gettysburg Address, letters from a Birmingham jail, and so that is a big thing in terms of King's describing why nonviolence works, why this is appropriate, why it needs to be done, and so if you're one of the ones taking your AP test, letters from a Birmingham jail is a very popular things that they'd like to see referenced or talk about. But I may have actually. I think it's on your Google Classroom. If not, I'll try to get you a copy posted. But a beautiful letter, and it doesn't take a long time to read, but really kind of gives you insight into the civil rights movement. And then we also have some other things. In 1963, you have Kennedy begin to campaign for re-election for president, where he decides to make civil rights a key part of his platform. Okay, to really he calls it a moral issue, and says that it's really something that should happen. He does that in June of '63. Remember, he's assassinated in November of '63, so we can only speculate and guess what might have happened. And then in August of '63, we have Martin Luther King Jr.'s March on Washington. Huge event, multiple people, and that's where King gives his "I Have a Dream" speech. okay, which is again a very famous address in American history. And it kind of, is always kind of brought up as a precursor, unfortunately, to what would happen to him. And within 5 years, he would not be able to experience the promised land, as he put it, with integration, right, full integration, because he's going to be assassinated, along with actually John Kennedy's brother Robert in 1968. So, but again, the nationally there begins to change some things in our country because people are seeing the treatment that the African Americans are getting. So the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65 are passed largely because our population is in favor of protecting the civil rights and things that are happening, especially in the South. Now, I've told you, though, since even before the Civil War, we have a tendency to view the North as the good guys and the South as the bad guys. Well, one thing that the 1960s clearly brings out is that there's a lot of bad guys in the North, too. Okay, so remember that we talked about the Great Migration. We talked about, cities in New Jersey, okay, and other states where Detroit, where we have a massive influx of African Americans that are working there. Well, like I told you, that discrimination in the North really begins to be substantial. African Americans, it's one thing to have them take jobs when it's needed during a wartime. It's another thing to compete for those jobs afterwards. And so the discrimination is real in the North. And if you get an economic downturn like you did during the later 1960s, inflation starts to hit our country because of the Vietnam War. And as you know, economies kind of do this anyways. You have discrimination plus now a large segment of the population that might be losing their jobs. That is not good. And so what ends up happening is you have these race riots start. The most famous one being in Watts and things like that. And so it opens everybody's eyes to this violence now that starts happening. So while in the early part of the 1960s, Americans are used to seeing African Americans kind of sit passively by while they're being kicked, beaten, and things like that. And now, as the 1960s roll on, though, you see race riots where African Americans are fighting back. And you see violence escalating, and now people are seeing this. And you start to have some other voices who are willing and able and advocate for either separation of the races, like what Malcolm X wanted, was fine with separation, or and even it's controversial, but many believe he advocated for violence if necessary. Well, now you've got a real, even more aggressive voice coming from the Black Panthers. Leadership with Stokely Carmichael and other aspects of this movement. You've got people openly advocating for violence if necessary to gain full equality. And so now this is impacting a lot of Americans who begin to be a little afraid of some of these things. There's freedom marches going on, though, still in the South. There's, other things in the South continuing to happen, protests to desegregate multiple areas, but you have that kind of that tension in the North, okay, with violence as well. So Americans after '65 and through '68, you see King assassinated, Malcolm X is assassinated. You see protests going on against the Vietnam War, and then you have some voices calling for radical things. So, of course, many members of the white media are going to jump on that and kind of highlight that. And so what you see begin to happen as the 1960s kind of goes on is you see, while segregation is fought against, the discrimination is fought against, it's highlighted, you see the gains kind of stagnate, to be honest with you, it seems, because there's so much fear and concern over what's happening to society. You already had a very unpopular war in Vietnam, and now you've got racial tension where rioting's happening in the streets. By '68, you have the Democratic National Convention, which goes very badly. So this is all exploding um, in our country. And the good thing, one of the resources I have talks about why did the civil rights movement succeed. And so for a lot of people, it's a loaded question because what does success look like? Um, and people push back today about that. That really the civil rights movement has a lot more to go. We have a lot more to do. When you look at, sports has dealt with this, right? When you look at team owners and head coaches, and um, so many of them are still predominantly white. And why is that? Are there not qualified African Americans? Is it discrimination still? Are CEOs of companies that are African American, are they making the same wage and things like that? So it still really is a big issue in our country. Now we've seen in your lifetime, it's been more about police action in our cities. Okay, stop and frisk, and some of those other things. The number of African Americans killed by white police officers. And you see a real dialogue happening and pushback from both sides. You see issues like affirmative action and this idea of discrimination. Is that the right way to go about it? Some say yes, some say no. So the civil rights movement continues to be a controversial thing, even looking back. So a lot of success, a lot of role modeling nonviolent protest and what it can achieve. But then we also see our cities explode, and that is something we've seen in reality in our lifetime. So that is still a part of us and here with us. So again, there's some major issues here during the civil rights era. So when we talk about having a voice in our unit and the question that you have, remember there were some really big successes. But again, every step of the way, you have to fight back against those forces that are trying to limit that success. And if you watch the freedom rides, it really is just a really interesting thing. And just be aware that the North does not, shows itself to not be the promised land that African Americans hoped for and thought about. One thing I've always thought was interesting, I've kind of looked back on it as I grew up, because we all have a socioeconomic racial background that sometimes we take for granted. We just assume that as we look at the world, that's the way it is. I remember there was a show in the 1980s called Unsolved Mysteries. And you'd watch it, it was on NBC, and it was Unsolved Mysteries. They would create a scenario of who killed who, a family went missing or an individual went missing, and you'd watch this, and it would leave you at the end like, geez, I wonder what happened there. Thinking back on it, though, one thing that I remember was it was always kind of these upper middle class stories for the most part, and predominantly white, by the way. If they did, and I don't remember exactly how many African American stories they had, but if they did, it was an upper middle class kind of socioeconomic individual. And if you look at the crime rates in the cities, 60s, 70s, 80s, there were no unsolved mysteries in the urban areas. There were no unsolved mysteries among the African Americans. So there was kind of an implicit bias in that I think back now and I pick up on that. And so these issues are really not going away anytime soon. But the civil rights era was important. Think of in your lifetime you've seen an African American president. If you went back 50 years ago, that would be unfathomable to people in the 1960s. We did have our first African American Supreme Court justice, Thurgood Marshall, which was a big deal. And then within 50 years, you have an African American president, which is definitely a step in the right direction. Will we ever have a female president? My guess would be yes. But we'll have to wait and see. And so that's often looked at as a civil rights issue, as well as some other groups today. So discrimination is a term that I think we need to clarify a bit, because you and I discriminate all the time. I'm wearing this hat right now, so I'm discriminating against all other high schools in the state because ours is the best, obviously. But that is a form of discrimination, right? But we often recognize that not all discrimination, at least in terms of that simple example I gave you, is bad. But the type of discrimination we know is bad when it's done for religious, racial, all sorts of different categories we use today. That's not the type of discrimination that we were in favor of. So that ongoing dialogue needs to happen, especially when we evaluate something like having a voice. Okay. So as you look at that, we've kind of gone through all the major groups that I've kind of put up on the, as far as our parameters go to answer that question. Keep outlining. When you say something, say it, right? Say, use the the limitations I've given you in terms of pages to really make your points count. There's so much here you shouldn't need to put filler in there or or long quotes. Avoid that if you can. But there's a lot of different groups with having a voice. I think you can really do a good job with this. But that outline really helps because it just builds your house for you if you think of it that way. And then the writing should be easy for you. I didn't like to write, and I know you probably don't either. But it is easier when you do things this way in terms of your outlines. And if some of your friends aren't engaging, give them a text, remind them. I'll put a reminder on the stream. But I want to give you guys college credit. Okay, so let's make this happen. My son is in college right now and just registered for classes yesterday, and his high school credits are still paying huge dividends for him. He didn't have to take a couple classes again because of the college credits that he had from high school. So this does definitely work, and do your best. I did put up some AP updates too for those of you who are taking the test. It's open book. It's one 45-minute question. I mean, you can't. You probably will never have an opportunity like this again. But they do limit your time, so you do have to know what you're doing. But not anywhere near what you'd be expected to do normally. So there's some review I put up there as well. So there's a lot you can do. But take this weekend and relax and chill. And there's a lot of good things on Netflix. I haven't seen that Tiger King yet. I heard it's kind of crazy and it's like a train wreck. But maybe some of you have. But there's a lot of good shows definitely on Netflix. I should remember go back look at some of those movies I recommended. Shout out to Pedro, who did his extra credit on the Cobbling of the American Mind, read the book, and sent me along his notes on the book. So that is still an opportunity for all of you to do. And I guess that's it for now. Email me with any questions. Have a great holiday weekend if you celebrate those holidays. And I'm thinking about you. I really miss interacting and laughing with you and picking on you and listening to funny voices and you guys picking on me. And, I would tell you to do that, but you don't need to do that. That's fine. But I do miss you. And I hope we're going to see each other soon. Anyways, have a good one. And peace out.